so that the filibustering begin.
I rise today to begin to filibuster. I will speak until I can no longer speak. I will speak as long as it takes.
I'm prepared to stand on this floor and talk about the need for this body to come together for frankly as long as I can, because I know that we can come together on this issue.
You can call what I'm doing today whatever you want. You can call it a filibuster. You can call it a very long speech. I'm not here to set any great records or to make a spectacle. I am simply here today to take as long as I can to explain to the American people the fact that we have got to do a lot better. Now let me just enumerate some of the reasons.
We're engaged in a filibuster, a way to divert attention from what we're doing today, to obstruct, and that's what's going on today.
Hello and welcome to Filibustering History, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, the lead faculty for the history programs at Southern New Hampshire University's Global Campus. Today we're doing something a bit different. Julie Mujic and Jason Engle are local historians who, with the help of a team of volunteers, recently curated and launched an exhibit titled We Shall Remember Them, How Columbus Remembered the Great War. That is Columbus, Ohio, which is on display now through April 30th, 2019 at the Columbus Historical Society. Now, this past Sunday was November 11th, the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, and I sat down with Julie and Jason in early October to discuss their careers as historians and their experiences in creating and hosting this exhibit. Now, unfortunately, my old bowling companion, James Fennessy, stubbornly doesn't live in Columbus, so he wasn't able to join us for this conversation. But the show must go on, and all of that. So here's what Julie and Jason had to say. So what is your name and what do you do?
My name is Julie Mujic, and I'm a historian.
Great. And can you tell us a little bit about your academic and your professional background?
Sure. So I have a accounting and operations management degree from Indiana University in Bloomington's Kelley School of Business. So I went to business school straight out of high school, and then after I finished business school, I joined the FMP program, the Financial Management Program at General Electric Lighting in Cleveland, Ohio. And I went through a full 2 years of the FMP program, graduated from that, and decided that I did not want to be a financial analyst. So I went to grad school at Kent State, initially thinking I was just going to get a master's degree in history, but then I realized very quickly that I loved it and I wanted to go sort of as far as I could go. So I finished up my PhD in 2012. In history, I'm a Civil War historian. And then I took a tenure-track job at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut, where I taught for 4 years. And then a job opportunity for my husband brought us to Columbus in 2016. I taught for 2 years as an adjunct at Capital University and became involved in a variety of other sort of historical projects around the city. Over the course of that time, it became pretty clear to me that there was enough freelance work in the city of Columbus that I could sort of cobble it all together and create my own business. So in 2017, I started Paramount Historical Consulting, which is an LLC, and I contract freelance history work of a variety of different projects.
Okay.
And then, and so I've been doing that for a while now. This past August, I started as a visiting assistant professor in the Global Commerce Department at Dennison University, which is a one-year position in global commerce. And they essentially wanted someone who had a business background and a humanities PhD of some kind. So because I have a history PhD and a business degree and business experience, those two things combined work for them because they are trying to teach global commerce from a humanities perspective or through a humanities lens. So I'll be there for a year, and we'll see what happens after that, but I'm still doing consulting work on the side as well.
Oh, that's great. So what was your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on Midwestern University students during the American Civil War and how they justified staying in school rather than enlisting. In the North and South, most colleges and universities emptied their classrooms and basically shut down during the Civil War, but in the Midwest, students stayed in a lot of places, and in particular, the University of Michigan was the largest university in the nation by the end of the Civil War. Their enrollment increased. So I look at Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan. They were the only 3 viable state universities at the time of the Civil War, and how their students sort of created this rhetoric around loyalty and the relationship between education and loyalty. And my book, based on that dissertation, is under contract with Fordham University Press.
So when they came up with this rhetoric about loyalty, so were they arguing that staying in school to become better educated will help build for a stronger country? Is that kind of what they were thinking for this patriotism angle, or where were they going with that?
They were arguing that obtaining higher education was as equally as patriotic as fighting, because they were, as you said, sort of practicing, they were preparing for this leadership role that they envisioned for themselves during Reconstruction. And the communities in which these universities are located encourage that. Instead of sort of guilting these young men about remaining, they were very excited when enrollments went up. They were very excited to see how many men showed up every fall to be students at these places. And so it was a different region of the country. And one of the things I'm doing for the book is looking at why that was, right? Like, I've gotten to the point through the dissertation where I can explain how the men argued this, or how the students felt, and how the faculty members felt. But the why is what I'm currently working on. And I contend that it has something to do with the growing significance of the Midwest's economy as a part of the national economy during the Civil War.
Was it also a component of just the size of the population, because we didn't need to? It's one of the things that always comes up when I'm doing survey classes on the Civil War and all of that, is that one of the advantages that the Union had was that their population was so much higher that they didn't have to dedicate as much of their population to the war effort. They were able to kind of hold people back, so to speak, to do other cool stuff, like build railroads and all of that.
Right.
Do you think that's kind of playing a role in that? Or
Somewhat, but you didn't see that in New England, and you didn't see that in the Mid-Atlantic states.
Okay.
So you still saw university students pressed into service, and there are several important studies that have been done over the last few years of the universities that were depopulated, both in the North and in the South. And the Midwest really stands out as a unique situation there. And it may have been because it was still sort of emerging out of this frontier mentality. Everything was new there, and there was a lot of emphasis on growth. There was a very small downturn economically in the beginning of the war, and then things really picked up. And in fact, during 1861, 62, and into 63, there was a wheat shortage in England and France, and the Midwest basically fed those countries as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that in the middle of the Civil War, we are still helping to feed the world.
Yeah,
that says something about the American.
We're feeding the North, we're feeding the Army, and we're feeding Europe too.
Yeah, the resources and all. That's amazing. Okay, and so you're doing. You said that you have your own history-based business.
Right.
So what type of work do you do with that? You mentioned that you do consulting and all that. So what are the type of things that you do with that?
So far, what I basically did was I created a website that has like 6 functions, 6 services that I'm offering. And I think over time what will happen is that I'll see what kinds of other things come my way. I'll see what else I can solicit in terms of contracts or work. And then I'll be able to narrow it down or figure out, A, what I enjoy, B, what is needed, and C, what makes money, right? Because that's why I'm doing this. So right now I've been doing indexing work, which is really fun for me. I enjoy doing indexing, which is not something that a lot of people enjoy doing.
Right.
But it's very detail-oriented, which I like. I get to use Microsoft Excel, which comes from my financial background that I enjoy, and I can do it whenever I want and wherever I want. And that's really important for me because I have 2 children. And so I can do an index at 5 in the morning in my pajamas in my office and not have to leave the house. So I like that. Other things I've done that take me out of the house, I did a large oral history project for Columbus School for Girls. I did 95 recorded video oral histories and of alumni and faculty and staff. So I did that for 7 months, which was really very fun. And then I also indexed those. So went through and created a way for them to be searchable by topic. So that was something that was really cool. And then various speaking engagements. And then the Columbus Historical Society factors into that as well, because through the grant that I wrote to get the money for this program, there's a piece of it that will be a salary for me.
Okay. For the School for Girls project, was that something that they initiated and they wanted you to do that for them for their own purposes, or was there a third party, or was that just something that you were pursuing? And
when I started the business, I had been doing a lot of networking in Columbus to try to figure out the professional opportunities for a historian. So I basically, for about 6 months, had 6 to 8 meetings a week. Coffee, lunch, just sit down and meet people, phone calls, whatever. I was building a network here in Columbus. Mm-hmm. And I went into every single one of these meetings and I basically said, I've arrived in this city, I have a history degree and a business degree. What do you see for me on the horizon? And I just listened to what people said, and they sent me in a lot of different directions. It was fantastic. Everyone I met introduced me to 8 more people. And so through that, over the course of sort of February through October of 2017, I interviewed for different kinds of jobs. I was able to meet a lot of different people in Columbus. One of the things I did specifically was I started attending lunches at the Columbus Metropolitan Club, which is a large organization. It's about 1,400 members, gets together every Wednesday for lunch to hear a topic, but they conscientiously network beforehand. Mm-hmm. And so I just started showing up at those. At one of those lunches, I met an alum of Columbus School for Girls, and she and I really hit it off, and she brought me into the school and introduced me to the president, who interviewed me for a teaching position that I could not take because it conflicted with my role at Capitol. So I pitched them 4 other ideas. I said, okay, it may not work for me to teach here, but I can do other things as a historian for you. So I pitched them 4 ideas, and they liked the idea for the oral history project. So they hired me to do that.
That's really interesting because it's different. Because, in history graduate programs, we're not taught to do that kind of stuff. It's
right,
really
that comes from my business degree.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say this stuff because a lot of people that are coming out of history degrees would never think to do that kind of thing, and that's really interesting to hear. And I think it's going to be useful for people that hear this because I don't know if I never learned that.
You don't learn anything like that,
right.
in grad school or anything like that. They don't tell you how to do.
Yeah.
No, that all came from when I was at IU getting my business degree. I was in Alpha Kappa Psi, which is a co-ed professional business fraternity, and they taught networking and they taught all of these skills, and I have always used them. So I knew networking was going to be the way, and I've been able to help on different projects. Even from, there was a new statue that went up in Westerville about Prohibition, and I helped work on that project, and that's all just through people that I've met. So it is important.
Yeah, and that actually is one of the things that has come up during doing these series of podcasts is that because even a lot of us that are in the teaching side of history, a lot of us get our jobs through networking. Adjunct positions often come because you happen to know someone who knows the department chair of the place or something. That's how I got my first adjunct job at Columbus State, I knew one of the people that already was adjuncting there.
Right.
And so we get a little bit of that, but it's all very informal and ad hoc and all that. But I think it probably would be useful for them to be some sort of formal networking training. There needs to be some kind of a professionalization course that happens in PhD programs for historians and even MA programs probably too. But that's really interesting to hear.
No, and I think it is important. Everything from, I hired someone professional to do my resume and LinkedIn page. Mm-hmm. So I hired someone to do my website. So there is a level of professionalization that I had to sort of take from my first career and implement into this new situation. But it's working out well. The Columbus School for Girls project introduced me to over 100 very well-connected, wonderful people. And so that has spun off into other projects. I'll be heading down to Cincinnati next month to interview members of a specific family that are tied to Columbus history for 200 years now. And we're talking about possibly doing a project on their family history. And those are the types of things that interest me. I want to write business histories and family histories, and I want to write and I want to research, and this is a way to do it.
Yeah, that's great. It's also such a variety of topics. It must keep it interesting. You're not doing the same topic for the rest of your career.
Right. No, and this project at Columbus Historical Society has been great because as a Civil War historian, World War I is not something that was necessarily in my wheelhouse.
Right.
But I've learned a lot.
Yeah, I bet. how about we jump over, talk to Jason for a little bit, and then you can tell me a bit about what's happening here. So, what is your name? What do you do?
My name is Jason Engle, and I am I'm currently adjuncting at Southern New Hampshire University, teaching a couple classes there, mostly modern war and society. My background, my academic background is I got my doctorate at Southern Miss in 2017, so just this past December I graduated. And most of my emphasis throughout my academic career has been military history. So I got my master's in military history, and my PhD work, even though it's been a little dispersed, and my dissertation is not exactly military history, it's kind of military history-ish, but that's been the main focus of much of my coursework and research and everything else. So, and then also talking about different kind of backgrounds meshing. I also have an undergrad in business. I got my undergrad in business at Union College way back in 1997, and and before the turn of the century. But no, and I spent 10 years as an application developer, mainframe application developer, no less. So coding in like COBOL and assembler and really old school stuff that not very many people do anymore. And so I did that for 10 years at different places, Speedway, Super America, and Nationwide Insurance, JP Morgan Chase. Those are the three main places that I worked, and as a developer, and decided that I didn't want to do that anymore after about 7 years at Chase. So that's what kind of shifted me. Okay, what do I want to do? And that, I'd always had a passion for history, so that's kind of seemed like, well, if I had my druthers, if I could pick something, it would be that. Mm-hmm. And I knew that it wouldn't be something that I would make an extraordinary amount of money doing,
right?
But I knew that it would be something that I would enjoy, and that's, at that point in time, especially, that's what I wanted more. So that was more important to me than making money.
Yep.
Yeah. None of us get in this for the money.
No.
No. Yeah.
You said that your dissertation was on something military related. What was it actually on?
My dissertation looks at this right-wing paramilitary group in interwar Austria.
Oh.
So at the end of World War I, between World War I and World War II, okay. I'm looking at it's called the Heimwehr movement, or Home Guard movement, and it's kind of a collection of all these paramilitary groups in the different states of Austria, which are 8 states, I believe. So there are 8 separate little groups, but then they eventually formed kind of a national front. But it was still kind of loosely regional, but they put on like a national front, and they were turned out over time, or rather quickly, they became very political, and over time became quite a disruptive force in Austrian politics, and pushed Austria toward a more fascist bent. And that's why, because they eventually, I think by 1929 or 1928 actually, they started getting funds from Mussolini. He was basically funding all of their rallies and everything just to kind of upset the apple cart, trying to push the Austrian government to implement more laws that took Austria in a more farther right direction. And eventually, you have Engelbert Dollfuss come to power, and he starts ruling by martial law, because Parliament dissolves itself, which is kind of an interesting little interlude in history that a lot of people don't know about, but which is kind of entertaining. But somehow Parliament dissolves itself through parliamentary procedure.
That doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, it couldn't call itself back into order. So he took advantage of that opportunity and said, "Well, since we have no more Parliament, I'm going to rule by decree." And then he basically turns Austria into kind of an authoritarian state. So
that's interesting, because it makes sense, obviously, that these other right-wing groups kind of in operation in Austria. I mean, the standard story that we always tell about World War II or the interwar period in that area is that, there's this guy Hitler who comes to power, and then he just takes over Austria. But you got to figure there's probably people in Austria that were kind of like-minded, which made it a whole lot easier for him to walk in and just, reunite with Austria. So,
right, and there were, there were quite a number, obviously, that there were, but at the same time though, they resisted the Nazis. The Heimwehr did.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they supported Dollfuss. They supported that right-wing regime against the Nazis from 1932 to 1936 when they disbanded the Heimwehr. So for a period in there, they were themselves right-wing. They were not so much anti-Semitic. They were kind of what especially when you look at Austria, there's political anti-Semitism and then there's racial anti-Semitism. Well, the Nazis were racial anti-Semites, whereas the Heimwehr were more political anti-Semites, going back to Karl Lueger basically saying, I'll decide who's a Jew. Basically saying they used the moniker more as a derisive term than it really was. Okay, you're actually a Jewish person. I don't like you, kind of thing, because they had Jewish members. They took money from Jewish financiers. So it was more of kind of like I said, just a means of deriding somebody.
So is this more of a nationalistic movement than fascistic movement?
It was a Catholic.
Oh, okay.
A very, very, well, that's what I argue anyway. That it was a Catholic authoritarianism, because if you look at that Austria as part of the Habsburg history, you have the Habsburgs were kind of the self-proclaimed defenders of the church. From the Middle Ages all the way to its end in 1918. And so the Heimwehr kind of saw themselves as having that. They paired very closely. The church supported them. Every single one of their rallies were always on the weekend. They would have Catholic ministers conduct a field mass. So all the people there would go through mass. They had preachers would kind of give speeches in favor of supporting the Heimwehr. All this kind of stuff, and they were kind of pretty much in lockstep the whole way. So it was very, there were nationalistic elements to it, but overall it was more of a Catholic authoritarianism.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was different than the Nazis. Obviously, it was different than even the Italian fascists. It had its own little kind of bent to it. So.
And are you going to continue researching this topic, or are you going to move on to, or have you kind of put that aside, like most people do after their dissertations?
I've put it aside for. I'm hoping to get back to it in January. That's kind of where I'm seeing. I want to get back to it because I would like to publish it. I think there's a lot more cleaning up that I want to do with the manuscript. I think there's a lot more to be said about it. Because there's really not been a whole lot written about it. There's only a handful of people that have written anything substantial on the Heimwehr movement. And and two, I try to also place it in the larger European context. Whereas the Heimwehr was kind of an important hub. That's what I argue in the middle of Central Europe, because you have Hungary, which was authoritarian. You have the Nazis, which were fascist authoritarian. You have the Italians, which were fascist authoritarian type regimes. So they're kind of all around Austria. Well, the Heimwehr was important in connecting all these groups in power in these places, and they kind of connected through the Heimwehr and through their efforts to get money and to survive and to keep relevance and all that kind of thing.
That's it. That's really interesting. Well, I look forward to the book.
Yeah. Thank you.
So you mentioned that you've had experience with finding opportunities for people coming out of grad programs and all that. So what do you have to?
So I think some of the most interesting ones. Well, to be fair, I'm in Columbus, Ohio, which is a state capital. So a lot of the conversations and interviews and job opportunities that I've had over the last 2 years have been sort of in that either nonprofit or governmental worlds that live in a state capital.
Right.
So it really is sort of, maybe I'd have a different viewpoint if I wasn't here in terms of the kinds of opportunities, but there were great interviews, conversations that I had with politicians to be on staffs for in various roles, in political organizations. I had a couple of interviews at like a research think tank that was fantastic. Other nonprofit agencies that lobby in the state capital or are headquartered here. So I think there was a lot of interest in my background from both of those worlds, both nonprofit and also the government side. In the end, though, I ended up walking away from that quite a bit because in neither place could I still be a historian. And I had only recently left my tenure track job, and I wanted to finish my book, and I wanted to still be a historian. So I kind of decided to put a pause on those things. I know it's there. I think that's great, but I really wanted to figure out how I could, if there was a way to still be a historian. So some of the things that have come up that are in that world there are a lot of small historical societies that need executive directors, and they may not pay a lot, but they pay enough to have that be your income, have that be your main income, and the work, it could develop into more. It's all in what you make of it. So I had one executive director tell me that when she first took over the role, that the board was a mess, the board of trustees was a mess, and the pay was really low. But over time, she brought people onto the board that all had the same ideas in terms of development, and she was able to increase her income over time and create the situation that she wanted. And there are a lot of opportunities in public history, in museums, in sort of educational, museum education, and I'm more administrative. Like, I want to be a leader. So I was very drawn to these executive positions of historical societies. That's actually how I found Columbus, was that they still don't have one. And I just called up and said, hey, I want to be the executive director. Like, how do I get that job?
Nice.
They don't have any money to hire me.
Okay.
But it's, I've never been afraid of cold calling and just asking people, just introducing myself.
Yeah.
So I think those are the main areas. There's also are several companies nationally that hire freelance consultants to work from home. And for example, I'm thinking of one out of Atlanta called Heritage Works, WERKS. Okay. And they are a digital archiving company that they take from like celebrities or companies or sports athletes or a whole wide range of sources. They take their archival material, they digitize it, then they don't just stop there, they then sell it, or they figure out ways to market it or create products that company or sports team or celebrity or whatever can use to market their brand. It's sort of like brand management but with digital archiving. And there are a number of these companies that are growing. There's a company out of Chicago, there's a company out of Baltimore, somewhere in the Maryland area. There are other organizations, history associates, history makers, that are hiring historians. There's this one company in Chicago that is constantly hiring people to do oral history, but you have to live in Chicago. But there are plenty of them that, there are plenty of them that you don't need to live where they are. So it just depends on your own personal situation. A lot of people are going to be very happy to take their history degree and go get a 9-to-5, 52-week-a-year job doing analysis or doing writing or speech writing or all of these different things. There's tons of opportunities. That's not what I wanted for this particular phase in my life. Maybe someday I will. But I found that there was enough out there. I can have 3 contracts going at once. I can bring in indexing work, and I can have a different contract that's out of the house, and I can have something else that's on the road, and that's good for me.
You said earlier that you weren't interested in doing like the think tanks and all of that because that's not what you conceive of a historian being.
I would have taken that job.
Okay. But there were other ones that you said you kind of walked away
Yes.
from because you weren't as were those because those were
Right.
more like advocate, not advocate.
No,
but
they
like,
were advocacy positions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, and actually, there's a part of me that really would love to do that. But for example, I had a second interview that I declined for an advocacy role at a housing and homelessness coalition. There is a person inside of me who absolutely wants to do that every day of the week.
Mm-hmm.
But I know I just am at a stage right now where my children are and where I am personally that I wanted a different schedule. I wanted a different life for myself.
Okay.
But that, under different circumstances, I would have loved that job. The research associate at the think tank job, I was a finalist with 4 other candidates, all were PhDs, and I lost out to someone who just graduated with their PhD in sociology from Wisconsin-Madison. Great candidate. So I understand that. That I probably would have worked full-time for.
Okay.
The company that I've created, it's really busy some weeks, and it's slower other weeks, and those weeks I can do writing. I write for various blogs. I've published in magazines before. So it's sort of, I don't know, a cobbled together for my life. But there's plenty of opportunities out there, especially if you are excited or looking forward to having, to be honest, if you are looking for a traditional job that has like benefits and income and set vacation every year, you're golden. There's plenty of people that will hire you.
That's nice to hear. I mean, because as coming out of academia, as I'm sure as you did, and I know you did, I mean, we always hear the doom and gloom about the job market is awful.
Yeah, no.
But I think it's because we are always focused on the teaching angle of it, and that's something else that I think grad programs are really bad at, is pointing out that there are other employers out there who actually do want you.
Yes.
Because a lot of us,
they don't teach you, they don't tell you how can I pitch my skill set to someone else for a different type of job that's not just researching and writing history. They don't do that. So you're kind of like, at least for me, I felt like I got out. I have these skill sets, or these skills. I can research, I can write, I can do this, that, and the other. But I'm like, how does that translate to something else? I don't know what I can do with it. I'm just kind of like standing here like I'm holding all of like the pieces and parts of something, but I'm like, I don't know how to put this together.
But it does translate, and that's the thing, is I was always trying to teach my history majors when I was teaching at Sacred Heart, and even at Capital, like how to market yourself, how to take what you do in school or the skills you have and translate those into competitive skills.
I wish I had worked with you, because the thing that we always run into, of course, is that we're being taught by people who are full-time academics, and so they don't have that viewpoint of how the world works. They're like, well, I got hired at a Research One school. Doesn't everybody? And so I mean, I did the full-time adjunct thing for a number of years also, and so it's just, but we feel like that's all we can do, and no one ever really, very few people, well, in my case, none, come to me and say, no, you've got all these other opportunities. There's lots of people that would love to have your skills, but we just don't know when. And then there's also, I think, coming out of an academic background, there's still kind of those psychological hang-up about, I'm abandoning academia, I'm going over to the corporate world or something, and which is kind of a ridiculous idea to have, but it is something that I think a lot of people think about coming out of PhD programs and even MA programs. I
didn't have a problem leaving academia necessarily. I would still love to be in it. Like, if Sacred Heart were in Columbus, I would still be there. Yeah. If Dennison hires me full-time, I will be there. But I'm not afraid to be outside of academia. I am not willing yet to give up being a historian. If there was a full-time job being a historian, I would be that. Like, send me to the corporation of historians. I'm happy to join it.
Absolutely.
I'm not afraid of full-time non-academic work. I'm not willing to not be a historian.
Yeah. And see, I would almost, I think, well, I shouldn't say I would almost prefer it, but there's certain parts of me that would prefer almost being like a historian, just because that's what I love, that's what I really enjoy, being an archive rat and just sitting in the archives and just dealing with,
We should just form our own company somehow. I mean, we just have to figure it out. Like, I don't know.
But that was the hardest thing for me. My situation is interesting too, and I think Julie and I share kind of a similar situation here. Is we're both kind of here because of our spouses.
Yeah.
We're both kind of here against our will. We're just kind of like...
I'm here with my will. But yes, because of my spouse.
Yeah, and because, there are opportunities, if you come out with your master's or doctorate too, in history, there are a lot of opportunities if you're willing to, if you are able to move where the jobs are. There's jobs there. Right. You can find the jobs. But in this situation where you're not, upwardly mobile, where you can just kind of get up and just go wherever, right. It's you have to be creative. That's when you really have to, and that's kind of what I've been trying to kind of come to terms with and wrap my head around. And okay, this is my reality. How am I gonna make this work? Because right. I want to be a historian. I don't want to be, if I wanted to work in the private sector in the corporate world, I would just stay at Chase. I would have never left, and I would have found some other thing to do there when they got rid of all the mainframes.
Right.
Or whatever, but that's not what I wanted,
I do think, though, Jason, that for you and I, that's both a blessing and a curse, and that's going to be a way that the listeners are not going to be able to relate necessarily. Not all of them can. Like, I am told all the time, well, sure, Julie, you can start your company and pick and choose which contracts you want, but that's because you have the luxury of a husband who has a full-time job and full-time benefits and healthcare and all of that. And you have the same with your wife.
Right.
So it's tough because I'm sitting here saying, oh, you can do it, but I've also run into historians who are single or are expected to be the main breadwinner, and there is a different level of pressure there.
Yeah.
So, it's both a blessing and a curse, right? We're blessed that we don't necessarily have to worry about those very specific and important aspects, but it's also a curse that maybe we have too much independence and we aren't desperate, we aren't forced to find something.
Right. Yeah.
Or else I would be an advocate for homelessness right now.
Yeah. It's a weird situation to be in. You're kind of in this netherworld.
Yeah. But we're also the primary caregivers.
Yeah.
For children.
Yeah, yeah. When you factor in kids and which is, I think, a big reason why we're, at least for us, we have children that are needs very specific, educational environments. Mm-hmm. So we're kind of like, we found that and we're really happy about that, and we're when we're willing to stay for that. Stay put and stay where we're at, and so that's that's a good thing. But at the same time, though, it's kind of it's one of those things you just work through. I'm working through it kind of mentally, because I feel like, well, if I take a job that's not a history job, and then I feel like, well, what did you just do for this last 8 years of your life? Yeah. What was that for? Right. Why did you drag your family to Mississippi for 5.5 years?
Right.
And accumulate all this student loan debt in order, and then not do that. That's hard to reconcile. That's hard to make peace with. And I'm one of those. I fight that kind of stuff anyway, just in my head. I'm stubborn in that way, so it makes it even harder sometimes. But at the same time, it forces you to be creative, I think, and be resourceful and think about, okay, well, how can I do this? And luckily for me, in some regards, in some ways I'm patient, but in other ways I'm not so patient. It's kind of weird to say that, but I'm willing to wait in the long term, knowing that, okay, if I kind of keep knocking on the door, eventually somebody's going to let me in,
right,
kind of thing. But at the same time, I'm like, but when are you going to let me in?
Yeah.
Right, let me in now.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I know the feeling. I since I went to grad school here at OSU, I dragged my family here for it, and so I felt that type of pressure too. Luckily, my wife found a full-time job while she was here too, so we were able to kind of mooch off that for a while. But still, you still have that feeling that, okay, I need to do something with this degree that I just spent $18,000 on.
And has been sacrificed for.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I just lost 6 years of my life doing this or whatever it was, so I wanted to make sure I would do with it. All right, well, great. Well, so let's hear a little bit about the World War I exhibit here. So obviously you've made a bunch of connections, but how did all of this come about?
I joined the board of the Columbus Historical Society in June of 2017 because I was trying to get to know the organization, see what was going on with it. And they started talking about one day upcoming exhibits. They wanted to put together like a 3-year exhibit schedule type of thing. And it was right around the time, later that summer, when all of the riots were happening about Confederate monuments. Charlottesville happened, and, that was, as a Civil War historian, that was weighing a lot on my mind. I had written a few blog posts about it and other things, and so I was really thinking about Confederate monuments and that whole controversy nationally. And I knew that the 100th anniversary of the armistice of World War I was coming up in 2018, and so I said, what about if we do a World War I exhibit, but instead of doing like Columbus during the war, what was happening in Columbus during the war? That's like any city. Just take out Columbus, plug in any city. This is what they're doing.
I know someone who did that for a place for Manchester, New Hampshire.
Right.
Yeah.
I said, what about if we do post-war? What about if we do the construction of memory? The construction of memory is a really hot topic in the Civil War. It has been for a while now. It still is. And
in
with
World War I too.
Yeah. So I said, well, let's do the construction of memory and look at the post-war world. So I wrote a grant to Ohio Humanities Council, received that grant in February of 2018. I don't know when you signed up.
March.
Okay. So I guess we announced the program, and Jason somehow found it through the website.
Yeah. I think I found it because I was kind of doing the networking, not networking, but I was just looking around at, okay, where are all the different kind of historical, because it's funny because I'd been in Columbus since 2014, but I was writing my dissertation, working, and so I just kind of had my head down. And so when I was done, okay, now I'm going to start looking around. I got to meet people. So I saw, okay, Columbus Historical Society, what do they have going on? And then I found the program that must have just been up for just like a few weeks.
It was very, very soon thereafter. So we got the grant, then we announced the program. It was at the time listed as 3 events and 4 exhibits. It has now grown to 9 exhibits and 7 events.
Wow.
And so Jason came on board, and then we put together a research team of people who were willing to help us. And between March and mid-July, we did all of the research. That research team, by the way, included 3 summer interns, 2 from Ohio State and 1 from Capital.
How did you find these people? Did you just advertise, or did you get in touch with those universities?
We got in touch with the universities.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so did you know the one who is from Capital?
Yeah, he was my student at Capital, but he applied for this without knowing I was the person in charge.
Really?
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
So then I sent him an email and I said, do you realize this is my project? And he had no idea that it was me.
Nice.
Awesome.
So anyway, we ended up putting this research team together, and I would say March, April, it was pretty slow. I mean, Jason and I were both still finishing up other teaching responsibilities, but in May and June, we were every day. I mean, it was just constant research, pulling in everything that people could bring in terms of information. And then we set a hard and fast deadline for July 15th to accumulate everything and stop at that moment. Because with any research project, you can just keep going forever.
Right. Exactly. So you got to stop sometime.
We said, okay, we're just going to stop. Yeah, on July 15th. And then we started at the end of July building the actual exhibit panels and laying out the design and working with a printing company to print everything. But it was so much work, and it was so hard, and it was way more than we thought it was going to be. We were still hanging exhibit panels and assembling things the morning of the opening.
Well, that's a really fast turnaround.
I know.
To have the idea in February, March, and then the opening was
August 30th.
Yeah.
Yes, and we actually had a meeting. When was that meeting? We went out to that bar with the other people, and we picked the color scheme. Was that like the end of July? Yeah. We picked the color scheme at this meeting at a tavern, the end of July, and this one of the people on the board who came to the meeting, she has a museum studies degree. That's the other thing. Jason and I have no museum experience. Okay. None whatsoever. We have no public history background. We have no museum experience. So we were basically both like, okay, how do we even do this? So we met with 2 people on the board who have museum studies degrees, and they both sort of said to us on the way out, like, this is too much to do. This is not going to happen. But it's done. And I mean, it was...
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I knew it would happen. I just didn't know to what, how it would look. You know what I'm saying? I didn't know if it was. I didn't know if it was going to turn out the way it turned out. I mean, it turned out. I think I'm really satisfied with it. I think you are too, with the way everything kind of came together. But you know, we didn't know. There wasn't a far from a certainty at that point when we just kind of realized, you know, because they were throwing out all these, we could use this software and that software that neither of us knew anything about. And then I downloaded kind of like a free version of one of them just to see what can I do with this. And I just looked at it, and it reminded me like of a airplane, like a big 747, like the controls, like all these little these things over here. I'm like,
no, there was no way. The learning curve on these softwares they were suggesting. First of all, the softwares were thousands of dollars. And these are like, you know, graphic design and really high-end software. I don't know how to use any of that. So we ended up using PowerPoint and figuring out that in PowerPoint you can customize the slide size to any size you want. And then if you export it to a PDF, boom, you have an exhibit panel. So nice. They printed them from PDFs at the printing shop. And they're we use the same color scheme throughout. Again, picked by our museum people. And
yeah, I can see that. I mean, if you're doing this as a PowerPoint, I can see that. Yeah, you come up with the border and the background colors and the designs with the stripes and stuff, and it makes sense. You just copy that from slide to slide.
Yeah, we had one template.
That's really, I've used PowerPoint as kind of workarounds for graphic design stuff too. So I know how that works, but I've never seen a PowerPoint slide, you know, printed out like this, because I think this does look really good. And so on all these panels here,
best fake exhibit ever. And they're like, don't get me wrong, Jason and I are so proud, but there are a million things I would do differently if I could start from the beginning. There just are. But that's with any project you do.
Right. Yeah, and like you said, if you don't have any background doing this stuff, then the first time you do it is going to be very thrown together.
Well, you're going to kind of default to, okay, I know how to do this, and how can I kind of smash these together or make these work together, and you know, and that's kind of what we just did. It was just kind of just like a little, I don't know, it reminds me of like the little chain of monkeys where you just kind of hang one monkey on the other until it's finished, and you're like.
I had a vision, like I could see it in my head, right, what it could look like, but I had absolutely no idea if we could achieve it. So
when you're putting all these panels together, first off, where did all of the images come from? Columbus, was it from part of this collections here at the Historical Society, or where did you actually find all of these things?
A lot of them were taken by people on our research team, like actually went out into the community and took photographs.
Oh, okay.
Some of them were donated by specific organizations themselves, like for the Defense Supply Center Columbus. I went and met with them, and all of the pictures on the Defense Supply Center Columbus exhibit are they gave me a CD of photographs from their archive.
Oh, okay.
Everything that's related to Jeffrey manufacturing, I received from the Jeffrey company themselves directly. So Jason did a much better job than I did, but of like labeling where things came from. Somehow in the rush to get it done at the end, I just skipped that step.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to. A lot of like Ohio Memory has a gob of photos. You know?
Yeah.
So I used a lot from Ohio Memory, where I could, and you know, some of it's just archival documents that we got a good enough photo of that we could use. And
the Ohio Memory, is that a electronic database done through the state?
Yeah, well, Ohio History Connection.
In the Columbus Metropolitan Library, right? Or no?
Is it? It could be. It's possible. It might be more of a kind of a partnership of several places. It could possibly be. I don't know, quite honestly. But they have just a huge database of documents too. Documents, pictures, and so that's kind of one of the things that I did was, as we were looking through some of these things, and we got to the point where, okay, let's stop researching. Now we got to put together these panels. I was like, okay, well, I don't have like any pictures. You know, nobody wants to read a big giant panel of text. You know,
I can read a book for that. Right?
Yeah. Right. So I had to kind of find from different places some of those kind of pictures to bring some of that to life, at least through a photo, if nothing else, and and found some pretty interesting stuff.
So, and the team of researchers, all the text on all the panels, was that written by the entire team, or just by you two, or
just by the two of us? Some of the interns contributed some text, but we would have to edit what they wrote. There was one researcher in particular. There's an exhibit in the other room that has to do with Broad Street Presbyterian Church. He sent me a 12-page Word document that I then had to condense down into one, 3 by 5 foot panel. Right. So it was that type of thing, right? So the researchers did it. Like, these are volunteers, all volunteers. Like, we ended up doing a whole alcove exhibit on World War I background, and a retired Ohio State professor did all of that. But again, he gave me enough for an entire book, and it's like trying to bring it down.
That was another thing that we learned, is that, of all the stuff that all the research that we did, everything we found, this exhibit is probably like 10%.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
it drove the interns crazy. The summer interns were so frustrated because they would do all of this work, and then Jason and I would cut out like most of it.
Did you guys have a plan for, I guess not, since you said that it kind of expanded me up beyond your original conception of it, but did you guys have a sense of, we want to have 20 panels that we're going to fill, or did you even have any kind of sense of how many of these things you were going to do, or was it just kind of growing as you...
Well, I think we just kind of winged it as we went along, and too, as we kind of got an idea of the space, when we started looking at the building, this is as a space to put stuff on the walls.
Yeah.
I think it started to take a little more shape, and then we started, to see the size of these. I'm not sure what.
I don't know, like carpet panel.
The carpet panel things.
They're like
backer boards or
something.
Yeah.
Seeing the size of those, like, okay, it kind of helps you. Okay, this is the size. This is how much space we have to work with.
But we literally took blue painter's tape.
Yeah.
And outlined on the walls and on the boards like what size we wanted, and then we would take a measuring tape and measure that, and then create the panel to fit the space.
Oh, okay.
So we knew there was going to be 2 exhibits in this room, and originally 2 in that room. We ended up putting 3 in the first room.
Okay.
So we definitely knew sort of the organization, but until the rooms were empty, because there were other things in these rooms before we started, I couldn't see it. Yeah. There was one day, August 2nd, we just emptied both rooms out, so there was nothing. And then when it was a blank canvas, we could finally start to lay it out a little bit. This still isn't anything like what we thought it would be, but...
Yeah, I bet it would be difficult to come into just an empty room and try to figure out where is everything going to go. And
yeah, we had a kind of at least after we talked about it, we've figured out kind of a general sense just by the flow of the rooms. Like, here you come in the door, and how are we going to go snake around the room? You know what I'm saying? What makes sense as an exhibit for someone to go through? So eventually we kind of figured, okay, well, this will be this topic here, and we'll talk about this over here. And then it just slowly, I think, over time, just started to take form the more we kind of stared at it. And
the one thing that Jason and I were really insistent upon was having a narrative arc. So a lot of times when you go to see an exhibit, it's just a collection of stuff, but there's no story.
Right. Yeah.
So we made sure that, in part in the first room, it's like chronological. It goes through the background of the war, and then the armistice, and the reaction, and the parades when the soldiers came home, and then the building of monuments. This room comes into the veterans and their post-war lives, and then we end it with the permanent changes to the city landscape.
Okay.
So it has both a chronological and topical, but also a narrative. That we're really, really trying to tell a story. And so that was something that was really important to both of us, since we're both sort of narrative historians that way.
Right. And so you mentioned that there were a couple of people on the board that have museum studies backgrounds, and just by coincidence over the last couple of months, Southern New Hampshire University put on this symposium a couple weeks ago on kind of the current state of museum studies and all of that. And so I never knew anything about it either until this happened, and I kind of got this crash course on it and all of that. But some of the big topics in museum studies, or museology as they called it outside of the U.S., because we had international people involved, but some of the big things are all about like crowd flow and getting people from one point to another and telling a consistent, coherent story. So was this something that you guys were just doing on your own, or you said you had a couple of museum studies folks on the board? Were they also kind of bringing some of that stuff into it? No? Okay.
No, I mean, well, and for us, I think that's what, seeing some of the other exhibits, especially, it's harder at local history level, because you have volunteers
right.
who have different interests, and what you have is they kind of take all their different interests and smashes together, and then you have just kind of a smattering of, here's this kind of story, this story about this person, this is kind of interesting, this is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You get a lot of, it's overwhelming, you get a lot of little stories, but you still don't get a sense for the main, like Julie said, the main overarching narrative, what was really happening.
Right.
I think some of the most challenging parts is Jason and I wrote introductory panels to each of the exhibits that laid out the argument, right? Like, again, we're research historians. Like, we have to have an argument. We have to have a purpose. We have to
the historiography.
Yeah, we have to tell people why they're there and why it's important. We explained historical significance. We asked questions. Mm-hmm. And writing those introductory panels was often more challenging than, because you have to sort of bring together all of these disparate
mm-hmm.
points. And I so badly wanted people to walk out of here feeling like they didn't just come to see stuff, but they have something to think about now. Mm-hmm. I honestly wanted them to leave thinking, A, I've never thought about that before, and B, how I was hoping it would help frame conversations they were having about other topics going on in our country right now. Okay. And that's really just jiggle the brain a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So what connections do you see between what's happening here versus what's happening in the rest of the country? What were you hoping people would walk away talking about specifically? Because I think that's a goal that every historian has, is we want to try to get people thinking about it going forward. So right. In your own mind, what are you thinking are the connections between?
I'm not going to speak for Jason, he can say that himself, but for me, it was important as a Civil War historian to get people to understand that the Civil War is not the only war, nor is Vietnam, right? Those are the two main ones you think about when you think about monuments mm-hmm. that have been memorialized. And specifically in Columbus, World War I monuments are missing. They are in storage. They have been destroyed. They have been taken down and altered, moved over time. Why aren't people rioting in the streets about this? Mm-hmm. Why is it that no one has any idea where Columbus's World War I monuments are? Why is it that no one is very concerned that right now there is a massive World War I monument in boxes in a warehouse on Ohio State's campus where we can't find a home for it and no one wants it? And it may well not be there in another year. And I'm not saying because someone's going to take it and put it in somewhere. So I think that my issue is that people are spending a lot of time and sweat and tears and anger and blood and death to fight over Confederate monuments when they don't understand why those monuments were put up in the first place, who paid for them, who constructed them, the message that was given around them, and what they have come to symbolize over time. They're getting all worked up about that, but there were also these soldiers who fought in Europe in World War I. Do they deserve to be remembered? How do they deserve to be honored? Shouldn't we have a conversation as a community about how veterans or how wars should be memorialized in general, and then apply that same standard to all wars and all veterans, rather than picking and choosing which ones are important?
That makes sense. Hear, hear.
Yeah, no, and that was learning about, kind of jumping into this after it had already started a little bit, but when we met, and learning more about the rotunda panels and stuff. This is what I'm talking about. There was a World War I, or these big bronze panels in the rotunda. It was Sullivan Hall mm-hmm. that Ohio State took down. I'm not sure how many.
2012.
Okay, yeah. They
oh yeah. I remember seeing those at Sullivan.
They're in boxes.
Are they?
Yeah, they took them down, so they're just sitting there, and so many of other. We tried to find all these other bronze plaques that had the names of all the dead from Columbus in World War I. I mean, I don't know how many months we called around.
We searched and searched.
Yeah, and people called around. Julie and several other board members called around to this. We'll try these people in the county. Call the county, call the city, we're all over the place trying to locate this panel that has gone missing, and then between that and the stuff from Ohio State, it's kind of like, what in the world, all these things that otherwise, under normal circumstances, would be considered sacred, or just kind of boxed up and just. And I think part of it obviously is the historicization of World War I. After that generation dies off, people stop caring as much.
Yeah.
That's what you're seeing. That's what you're going to see. With World War II eventually in the next 20 years. Where some of these, and there's been a lot of debate on Holocaust studies about the Holocaust. People are dying off. That's becoming historicized, and people are concerned that once it becomes historicized, then it loses some of its bite in terms of what that really looked like and what the effects of that really were. In terms of it loses its visceral kind of.
Yeah, we're not living with it anymore.
Right, because all the people that were part of it are dead.
And then they become a memory.
Right, and then so you're kind of once you have that detachment, I think what this exhibit shows, I think, is once you reach that threshold, in a lot of cases, of course, the Civil War is a really interesting anomaly because it's different.
Yeah, I was just thinking is it's weird that Civil War is kind of come back to life in a way that, and who knows if maybe
which is kind of interesting too, because it really says that even though the people are dead, the conflict itself isn't dead.
Right. Yeah.
In more ways than
the
one.
memory of the conflict keeps shifting, right? And communities choose what to keep in the limelight and what to bury, what storylines to bury, and which ones to continue to argue about.
Right.
And there's no conversation about World War I. I mean, there was no National Commission for the 100th anniversary. There was not, a large national push for any sort of memorialization, and we still don't have a national World War I monument. There is, Kansas City would like to believe that theirs is the national, but it isn't, and there isn't something in Washington, D.C. And, there's just not being a lot being done on the local stage at all, or statewide. I mean, Ohio Humanities Council received a fair number of proposals, but nothing like they've seen for other major topics that have come and gone.
Yeah, and I'm thinking back to back in 2011, there was a huge, everyone was talking about the 150th anniversary of the start of the Civil War.
Right.
But yeah, in 2014,
yes.
I travel in historian circles. Right. Sure, there were articles. AHA or something had one on the beginning of the war or something in commemoration of the 100th anniversary, but there was nothing in the, like you said, kind of in the popular press or anything like there was with the 150th of the Civil War.
No, the Columbus Dispatch has done a pretty good job of trying to mark some of these occasions with stories, but it's largely been silent, and that's something that we need to have a conversation about.
Well, and it's interesting too, because in doing this research and looking at the newspapers like in Columbus, and looking at the language that they used in 1918. I mean, the fact that the United States was involved in this conflict, and the fact that they played a kind of a decisive role in the end, it was that final push in the Meuse Argonne or whatever that kind of finally made the Germans just say, forget it, it's done.
Right.
That was important. People realized that this for the first time ever, the United States on an international level was kind of at the apex of everything. They were the center of the world's attention. U.S. troops, United States as a country, and people realized that, and they were excited about it. They were excited that they were like, oh wow, these troops are doing this, our boys are doing this. This is really exciting. I mean, you look at the language, and like I said, in the newspapers and the magazines and stuff at the time, it's a big deal.
It was the war to end all wars.
Yeah, I mean, it really was. And now it's just kind of like, oh yeah, World War I. I don't really know much about that.
Yeah.
But World War II, I can,
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's part of it, is that it's seen as kind of, from an American perspective, it's kind of like World War II happened. Obviously, World War I didn't stick. The results of World War I didn't stick, and so while we went into World War I, and both sides were teetering, we went in and knocked one side over and finished it off, and so we fixed Europe, And then you Europeans, you went and screwed it all up again a few years later. So I don't know if that plays into it or not, but I can imagine that's...
I think there was just such disillusionment about World War I so quickly. I mean, from the fight over the treaty and Wilson and League of Nations, I mean, it just all went downhill so fast. And then it was overshadowed by the Great Depression and everything else. And I understand, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be discussing it.
Right. That makes sense. All right, and so you've mentioned that you're kind of hoping that that's the type of thing that people take away from this exhibit. Is there anything else you hope people take away from it?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a twofold thing. What we talked about, just the war in general, and how significant World War I was, and the fact that it was important to the United States, to the citizens of the United States especially. They were in kind of uncharted territory here, and getting involved in World War I, and playing or thinking they're playing a very big role in, and feeling like that. But so there's that element of it, that it was important at the time, and then there's also the memorialization part of it. The more contemporary right now is that we've just kind of discarded this war to a certain extent. It's kind of a distant thing that we don't necessarily know much about, aren't really interested in knowing much about, and because it is messy. It's not a very simple black and white, good versus evil type of thing that was constructed in World War II. That was easily digestible, and there it is. We have our narrative. This is what we're going with. Where World War I, there's plenty enough blame to go around for everyone. Everyone's screwed up, and nobody likes that situation. Nobody wants to. Let's not talk about that.
Right.
Let's talk about something else.
Right.
I think the other main thing that we'd like people to take away from this is that there are parts of Columbus that we can tie directly to World War I. There are parts of Columbus's development that we can tie directly to World War I. And I want people to walk into the city landscape portion and look around and say, oh, I didn't know that street name used to be something else before it was changed, because it was a German name, and now they've changed it to some sort of American name. I didn't know that those 2 dorms on Ohio State's campus were named after World War I veterans who died. I didn't know that. I want them also to walk away with a piece of Columbus history and to understand more about the city in which they live.
Yeah, and I think that's a good goal also, because historians, and then also just kind of the history-minded general public, we always tend to focus on kind of the big national things. Right. And I like the idea that we're trying to get people to kind of realize history is local also. It's not just national. There's stuff happening. This city exists because of things that happened. Obviously, this city's here for a reason. Right. It looks the way it does for a reason. That's one of the things that I often try to push my students to do, like when I'm doing capstone projects or MA theses or whatever. I always try to push students who always want to talk about the Civil War. They want to talk about the glory of the Civil War. And I'm always pushing them, well, okay, but let's think local. What happened in your town, your county, maybe your state? Even that's probably too big, but think small. How did it affect what? Because every event in American history affects everybody on the ground. It affects at the local level too. And so I think it's great that this is kind of emphasizing the local perspective, because I think that does get lost a lot from...
And it's also emphasizing the consequences of a war that are beyond the returning soldiers coming home and returning to their dinner table, right? There are consequences that go on long after that. And the part of this exhibit on the veterans' post-war life that Jason did really emphasizes that. So, I think, it really shows people that you can't sign an armistice and be done.
Okay.
Yeah, well,
thank you so much.
No, thank you. This was great. And thank you all for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments for this podcast or suggestions for future episodes, as always, send me an email at workinghistorians@gmail.com. For Jason Engle and Julie Mujic, I am Rob Denning. Our next episode will come out the week after Thanksgiving, so I hope you have a happy start to the holiday season. Take care, everybody.